July 4th weekend is fraught with emotions for many of us. History in general is tangled, complicated, and often ugly. It's kind of like scripture. Now, hear me out. If you have read the Bible, like in its entirety, and not just the passages we use in the lectionary, or those passages that are popular. Have you really read it? There's lists of names, like only male names, really. Or dimensions for building that are kind of boring. Or descriptions of brutal attacks on other people, sometimes for not very good reasons. If you have if an ounce of empathy or goodness, some of it will not sit well. Now, I love the Bible. I wouldn't be where I am in life if I didn't think it was one of the most important books in the world. But it's not perfect because the people writing it weren't perfect. I think of my ancestors. As much as I love them, as much as I love my family history, not all of them were perfect people. In fact, I'm pretty sure none of them were. My great-grandma Alice is someone I loved deeply, but it wasn't until later in life that I found out some of the ways she wasn't perfect. She was a bad mother in many ways. She was racist. She played cards a bit too much. She took advantage of some of her privileges in ugly ways. But love isn't about agreeing all the time, as my spouse could surely tell you. Love is a commitment. My spouse and I try to make each other better, even if it's not always comfortable. Sometimes uncomfortable conversations need to be had in order to make our union more perfect. The future generations of this country are often the ones trying to have these conversations with the rest of the world. Young people are spread out, risking their health and well-being while calling for something bigger than themselves all over the world. And some older people are too, right? Being called to our better selves isn't always comfortable, but generational change comes. My grandparents grew up during the Depression, during rations in the World War II era. They fought in World War II and in Korea. My grandparents were able to see the racism of their own parents, but not always themselves. Because systemic racism is bred into our society in ways that are difficult to see. Sometimes it's like a flowering invasive weed that, while blending in and seeming nice, is stealing life from those around it, while looking like it's offering something to the world. Racism is like that. If you could see it in your parents or grandparents in ways that they couldn't, imagine that maybe young people today are calling us to shake off the binds of what makes racism generational. Today's generations of those affected most personally by racism, they don't have time for a few more generations of change. The generations before us were civil rights leaders, feminists, advocates for LGBTQ rights, labor rights, and human rights. They were change makers. They were people like Harvey Milk, Alice Walker, Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez, Malcolm X, Governor Jerry Brown, Fred Rogers, Robert F. Kennedy, Neil Armstrong, Barbara Walters. They are people who could have us keep changing, keep singing, keep marching, keep doing whatever it is that changes this world for the better, even if the birthing pains are hard. Marianne Williamson, someone who's been trying to make change in our political system lately, says, "Faith isn't blind, it's visionary." It was for so many in the silent generation who would envision new ways of being a church. In fact, it was upon the efforts of this generation that my denomination, the United Church of Christ, was formed. The UCC is a product of the optimism and penchant for peacemaking that are gifts of some of our elders. They sought a united Christianity, not in creed, but in a shared love for the goodness of the Christian message. unity in diversity, orthopraxy over orthodoxy, practice over doctrine. These values we promote as a denomination remain pretty radical today. Those who have gone before us in the great search for liberty and justice have taught us to be cautious optimists, compelled by great love and pragmatism. In this nation's past are reformers, peacemakers, and stewards. Many of you have experienced hard times and harsh circumstances brought on by economic circumstances, by downturn of our economy and war, by the pandemics and crises of other historical moments. But you've also experienced, perhaps, continued betterment and rising affluence. Anyone who has experienced social mobility knows how much it changes your life. It's something that we have to be optimistic that can be shared with future generations, a sense of rising up and doing better that can seem impossible in the face of rampant white supremacy, global warming, and the growing disparity of wealth in this country. But as Christians, we are called to be ethical optimists. It was necessary in the civil rights movement in order to bring about change. So was rage. So was defiance. So was a willingness to be arrested and painted as a criminal. The great progress we made as a nation would not have been possible without the dignified commitment of those who participated in boycotts, sit-ins, or without the compassionate wisdom of leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who dared optimism in the face of racism and systemic injustice. As I wrote this sermon, I went to my weathered 1963 copy of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Strength to Love. It's a gift from my father-in-law. I opened the table of contents and found the first sermon title in the book to be A Tough Mind and a Tender Heart. King and many in his generation knew that those two things, a tough mind and a tender heart, were necessary to, as he said, guide our action in the crisis in race relations, and to move more creatively toward the goal of freedom and justice. King was comforted by his belief that God was also tough-minded and tender-hearted. He said, "We can be thankful that our God combines in his nature a creative synthesis of love and justice, which will lead us through life's dark valleys and into sunlit pathways of hope and fulfillment." It was the sense of love and justice that Martin Luther King brought to the civil rights movement, and that characterized many Christians in a generation. A tough mind and a tender heart. I think we need those traits now, in this moment. We need to do our research to educate ourselves and get rid of the revisionist histories that try to whitewash Beethoven and paint George Washington as a good slave master. Human beings are complicated, and we are all victims in some ways of our historical moment. But to celebrate people blindly, without acknowledging the harm they did to significant portions of our population, of the world, is to reinforce that harm. Because let me tell you, Black people have not forgotten that so many of our presidents were slave owners. People of color have not forgotten that the Confederate flag was used to fight a war over white supremacy. Underserved members of the population have not forgotten how arguments over property rights and who had rights to what resources has been used to keep certain members of society from owning property, from leveraging wealth, from participating fully in the dream that we call American. What I do know is that many of our ancestors believed in disciplined self-betterment, in the promise of science and medicine, and in the type of compassion and sense of justice that led a generation to try to end segregation and reach equal rights. Each of us has hopefully honored and loved the sacrifice of our parents, and yet sought to open their hearts more widely. The words of Helen Keller tell me that deeper faith that weighs the ugly facts of the world, yet hopes for better things and keeps on working for them, even in the face of defeat. Our ancestors were as imperfect as we are, yet their dreaming, like ours, can perhaps reach beyond the limits of what we think is possible or even right. It is with great love for this country and its people that leads us to be critical of our institutions when necessary. When my grandma's Bush-era stimulus check came in the mail, she sent it right back and wrote a letter demanding that money go to someone who needed it. That probably didn't do much good. But she watched the news every night and tried to stay informed. She was imperfect. Some of us have seen change happen and know that our institutions can be reformed if we give them the attention they deserve. Our belief in our institutions cannot be uncritical, though. We have to understand that our institutions are as fallible as we are and need our diligence and care in order to do the good they were built to. Martin Luther King Jr. knew that the voice of the church needed to meet the voice of government in order to make sure our laws were just. While compassion might be part of our ideologies, compassion transcends ideology. We must learn to reach across lines and look for friends in new places. Mr. Rogers, a Presbyterian minister, brought his message to the world in a new and different way for a church leader. He taught us a central Christian message, that we're all neighbors. He believed in people, all people, and believed that with attention and care, each of us could be exceptional in our own right. While dominant lenses of my generation, formed in many ways by experience of history unfolding, and by the generations that raised us, each generation is incorporated into our being. I am my grandmother, and my mother, and my great-grandfather. I can see pieces of each of them in me. And likewise, though I'd never met my great-great-grandmother, she's in me too. My ancestors raised the people that raised me. They viewed their ancestors differently than I do, and certainly my children will as well. I hope, though, that all of us will be as strong of mind and as tender of heart as some of our ancestors idealized, that we will meet this moment with the strength of our convictions. This moment in time can help us learn about our past, take ownership, learn. This moment in time can help us see clearly our now, take ownership, listen, speak. This moment in time can help us dream for a beautiful future. Take ownership, dream daringly, because the limits of our future are the limits of what we believe is possible. So believe it, dream it, do it, for our nation's ancestors, all of them.